I'm delighted to be here today. This is my first experience speaking for the Social Enterprise Program, but I've heard wonderful things about it and met many of the graduates, and they are terrific people. So obviously you're doing a great job. I'm just going to put this over here in case it helps. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today, just to get us on the same page, is a bit about my New York City charter school study so that we all know what the study found, and then I'm going to be a bit more speculative about why it is that we don't know more about what charter schools do and how it is that we could learn to have more successful charter schools in the United States and have them be an even more important part of American education. I think actually in terms of setting up my presentation, nothing could have been better than Chancellor Klein's talk, because he really talked about the role that charter schools play in school reform in New York City, and I think that's also the role that they play more generally in the United States. What I'm going to do is drill down a lot from what he was talking about and talk about how we know whether they're effective or not and what makes them effective. So if that was the 10,000-foot picture, I'm afraid this is more like the 100-foot picture. Okay. So what I have been doing in New York City and Chicago is doing a lottery-based study of charter schools. And let me just tell you a little bit about how they work so that we all know. Most charter schools in the United States are oversubscribed and they use lotteries to admit applicants. That's true of all the charter schools in New York City except the charter school for autism. And about 88% of US charter school students are admitted via a lottery. So the vast majority of charter school students in the US are admitted via lottery. 97% of students in New York have been admitted via a lottery. So it's normal. What we do in a lottery-based study is very simple. We use the lottery to give us randomization between the group of students who get lotteried in or go to the charter schools and the group of students who serve as the control group. Those are the students who are lotteried out. So you can see that it's just like a medical experiment where you give some of the people the heart medication and you give some of the people the placebo, and then basically all you have to do is follow the two groups forward over time and you figure out what the difference is between the people who get the placebo and the people who get the heart medication, or in this case the people who get the students who get the charter schools and the students who remain in the regular public schools. Now the beauty of a lotteried out study is that the lotteries generate the perfect control group for the students who attend the charter schools. And this is really important because not just in New York City, but all over the United States, students who select into charter schools are different. They are much more likely to be urban, they are much more likely to be poor, they are much more likely to be Black and Hispanic. That's not just true in New York City, it is true everywhere across the United States. And furthermore, it's not just that they're different on things that we can observe, it's that they are very likely to be different on things that we can't observe. One of the things that we can't observe very well is family's motivation. And many people surmise, perhaps accurately, but we don't know, that the parents who send their kids to charter schools are more motivated, given their poverty, disadvantage, whatever else, than the parents who do not apply to charter schools. So that may be true, but we're not going to be able to know whether it's true. We also know that students who fit really well into the regular public schools and are thriving there do not tend to apply to charter schools. In fact, we can sort of see that in the data, although we can't observe it perfectly. So that suggests that the students who are going to the charter schools are worse, all else equal, given what we observe about them, because they are not on a terrific path. Now, the nice thing about the lotteries is that it doesn't just guarantee that our control group, in other words, the lotteried out student, are exactly alike on everything that we can see, like whether they're Black and poor, Hispanic, anything else. Okay, it does guarantee that, and in fact, we'll be able to show that with the data. But it also guarantees that they're alike on all the dimensions that we don't observe, like motivation, aptitude, whether you fit in the regular public schools, and that's crucial. Because then we are truly comparing apples to apples, and no one can complain in a lottery-based study that the reason the charter schools are doing better or they're doing worse has to do with who selects into the charter schools. Everyone has gone through the same process of applying to the charter schools. Everyone is equally motivated. Everyone is equally poorly fitting in the regular public schools. Okay? Now, it's vastly superior to other non-lottery-based methods, and I'm I'm a researcher, so I'm unabashedly going to make this point, and I'm going to come back to it at the end because it is important. The two other methods of evaluating charter schools, and for that matter many other education policies, are matching-based studies where we take the students who say go to the charter school and then we just try to find some students who we think are like them in the regular public schools. That's a matching-based study. Or what are called pure value-added studies, where we look at a student who goes to a charter school before they went to the charter school, while they were still in the regular public schools, and then we look at them after they go to the charter school. Now, it might sound like these are just as good as lottery-based studies, but they're not. Okay? The first type of study is just very unreliable. It's not that it never produces the right results. It sometimes does and it sometimes doesn't. And it depends a tremendous amount on how skilled the researcher is in choosing students who match the students in the charter school. And since there's no right way to do it, there are right-er and wrong-er ways, but there's no right way to do it, you will never know whether the researcher got it right, okay? So, I might know, but most people wouldn't know, and even I don't think I know the vast majority of the time. Pure value-added studies in the case of charter schools actually routinely, consistently produce biased results, and I can go into the reasons for that if someone is interested afterwards, but I won't go into the reasons for it now. But it's a consistent thing. It's not just that they're unreliable, they're basically always wrong. Okay, so what do we know about New York City charter schools from the lottery-based study we're conducting? Well, we know a lot because we've been studying the New York City charter schools, starting with their achievement data from the 2000 school year, which is the first year for most charter schools in New York City. We have virtually all of the New York City charter schools in the study. I'm not going to report on all of them today because, as many of you know, there are quite a few new charter schools out there that only have kindergartners and grade 1 students, things like that, and they don't have any achievement data yet. But for the schools that do have achievement data, we are reporting on over 95% of it. I told you that 95% of students in New York are participating in lotteries, so they're all in the study. We focus mainly on student statewide exam scores and on high school graduation, but when the students are old enough, we will also be able to look at college outcomes for them. We're going to look at a per year effect. That's because students, some of them stay in for 6 years in charter schools, some of them stay in for 3 years. So everything I'm going to describe is going to be per year of attending a charter school. Okay, the first thing I want to show you is that the lotteries are indeed random. They are. So the green bars are for the lotteried out students, the red bars are for the lotteried in students, and you can see that they are equally likely to be poor, black, white, Hispanic, in special education, English language learners, and they have incoming test scores for those who have taken a test before they apply to charter schools that are the same as well. Okay, so the lotteries are indeed random on the basis of everything we can see. You should also notice, if you look at the bars at the far left of this chart, that the vast majority of charter school students in New York City are poor and are black. And the ones who are not black are Hispanic. Okay, so there's virtually no white or Asian students in the New York City charter schools, and that's fairly important to keep in mind. Okay, how much do they raise achievement? I'm just going to follow them forward over time, and this is a very straightforward exercise. They raise achievement by about 1/10 of a standard score point per year in math. Don't worry, I'm about to translate these into meaningful things, okay? And about 1/6 of a standard score point per year in reading, okay? And 3 to 4 points per year of attending a charter school on the Regents exams. This one is relatively easy for you guys to interpret because most of you know that 65 is a passing score on all of the Regents exams. Most students who attend charter schools start out a little bit below that in terms of their predicted Regents exam scores at about 60. So that if they were to spend 2 years in a typical charter school, they would get over the passing threshold on a typical Regents exam. So 3 to 4 points per year matters quite a lot for them. In addition, we find that for every year students spend in charter schools, New York City's, in New York, the students are about 7% more likely to graduate from high school with the Regents diploma of some form. So we're not counting the local diplomas here, 7% more likely to graduate from high school with that diploma. Well, that means if you were to spend 4 years in a charter high school, you are 28% more likely to graduate with a Regents diploma than a student who was initially identical in the 8th grade, but who was lotteried out. Okay, and it's important to recognize that all of these things are relative to the lotteried out group. It's not that the lotteried out students or the control students don't make any progress at all. Of course, they do make progress, they do have achievement. These are gains relative to them that the charter school students have. Now let me translate these numbers into something more meaningful. So these effects look pretty moderate, and in fact, if we look at some of the things that Jonah and Doug will be talking about later, you will see some numbers from them that don't seem like they're terribly different in some ways. So they're moderate if we think about a single year. The key thing here is that attending charter schools has a very cumulative effect, and it's that accumulation that can really close the achievement gap. So I'm just going to show you, this is the true data. I'm going to show you an example from using math to try and give you a sense of what those numbers add up to. So on the bottom line here, where everything is at 0, it's the blue line, this shows you the achievement of the lotteried out students, which actually is very flat over time. They kind of stay just a little bit below the proficiency bar typically in New York State for most of their elementary and middle school careers, but in fact I've normalized it to be 0 for the researchers in the room. But in any case, it is rather flat. Okay? And the charter school students are gaining relative to them every year. Now the green line here just shows you the raw data. It has nothing, there are no statistics involved. All I did was I just plotted the raw data on this chart. And it shows you that by grade 3, the charter school students are ahead by about 4 points. And by grade 8, they are ahead by about 30 points. Okay? Now that's a very big difference because the achievement gap between students who come from Harlem's poorest neighborhoods in New York City and students who come from the Scarsdale Public School District, obviously just outside of New York, who are typically very affluent and not black or Hispanic, is 35 points, which is right at the top of this chart. So closing 30 out of those 35 points is really a huge closing of the achievement gap. And that's a much bigger achievement gap than many people talk about. Most people talk about, oh, the black-white gap in New York City or something like that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the gap between the poorest, mostly black students in New York City to very affluent students in a New York City suburb that is reputed to have good public schools. Okay, so it really does add up over time. I can also tell you that when we look at all of the data that we have on charter school students, these types of gains are what we see for students who spend a few years in charter schools. They make these per year gains, or a lot of years in charter schools, they make these per year gains. So we feel pretty safe extrapolating from what we see at this point. We have really a lot of data. Okay, so that's the Harlem Scarsdale Achievement Gap. This is the same for reading, and you can see they close somewhat less of the achievement gap because the numbers were somewhat smaller in reading. Okay, why are lottery-based studies robust? Well, the results are not affected by attrition, returning to the traditional public schools. That's something someone should ask me about the question period if you have a chance. Grade retention, schools with various win rates, they tend to have similar effects on charter school students or students who decline a charter school place. All the little niggling things that people worry about, none of these things affect the results, and there is a 96-page technical report online for those of you who really like tables, equations, and other things like that, that tests all these things ad nauseum. Okay, so now what causes New York City charter schools to be more successful on average, to have this positive effect relative to, say, the lotteried out students who would otherwise attend them and who go to the regular public schools? Well, it must be things that the charter schools have in common because there is a common positive effect among them. And those are things like the governance structure that they have. Charter schools, when economists think about charter schools, I'm an economist, when we think about charter schools, one of the first things we think about is the fact that they have a governance structure that is very different from that of the regular public schools. They do not have a school board that is voted in or that is political. Instead, they have governance like that of nonprofits, but they also have all these extra layers of accountability. They're authorizers who can decide not to authorize them when they come up for reauthorization. In New York City, they have city accountability, there's state accountability in New York, and there's federal accountability. So they have a pretty complex governance structure with about as many governors as anyone could possibly have. They also, families don't have to stay. This is the voting with your feet point. And it's important that the families don't just leave, but that they can take the school's budget with them. The charter schools have much more autonomous management than the regular public schools. I think almost every regular public school principal would love to have the sort of autonomy, control over management that a charter school principal does. They have much more discretion over hiring teachers, over which teachers they are going to ensure leave through one means or another. They tend to do routine diagnostic assessment of their students. Really, I'm not sure it's more often than the regular public schools now, because New York City regular public schools have also been increasing their diagnostic assessment of students. But clearly, relative to your typical public school in the United States, they do more diagnostic assessment. Nearly all New York City charter schools have either school uniforms or strict dress codes. Why, I don't know, but they do. And they nearly all have a lack of union work rules. There are 4 charter schools in New York City that converted from being regular public schools. They do have the union in them. There's also the UFT charter school, which certainly has the union in it. Unfortunately, the UFT charter school is the only charter school that has refused to join this study. I've tried to convince them, and I'm still very open to getting them to join. There's no reason why they can't join. Okay, so those are the things that might make them, on average, have a good effect. But of course, not all charter schools do have the same positive effect on students. So let's look at the distribution. What I'm showing you here, this sort of looks like a bell-shaped distribution. It is, in fact, a normal distribution. Is what we would expect from the regular public schools that serve the lotteried out students. So it's actually, I used the data on the lotteried out students and the regular public schools they attended to draw this sort of bell-shaped distribution. This is the distribution of effects for the charter schools. And you can see that, first of all, it's shifted to the right. What does that mean? It means that on average, the charter schools are having a positive effect relative to the regular public schools these students would attend. I've already told you that, so that's not new information. But you can also see that the distribution for the charter schools has a much higher peak. Well, what does that mean? It also means that the charter schools are actually having effects that are more concentrated or more similar to one another than the regular public schools have. That suggests that there's also pressure on them to all perform somewhat similarly, because they, in fact, have less diverse performance than the regular public schools do. Nevertheless, there's still some variation, right? There are charter schools that are out here in the right-hand tail whose effect on student performance each year is so high that if the data were not in my hands, I would not believe it. Okay, these are charter schools that have effects that are 0.4 of a standard score per year, so that they can literally close the achievement gap in about 3 or 4 years of having a student in their school, which is just weird. Okay, that's it's amazing. There are quite a few charter schools that have 0.2, and there are a lot of charter schools that are well, not a lot, but there are a number that are right here in this range where they are pretty neutral with the regular public schools, and there's a little cluster down here that actually have a slightly negative effect on students. So they're not all the same. So now what can we learn if we look at these charter schools and compare them to the charter schools down here? Are these ones doing something that's dramatically different than the schools that are not having such positive effects? So yes, we can learn something about what works, but I want to be very clear here that unlike the previous estimates, which are pretty much bulletproof, everything I'm about to show you right now is not, okay? And everything that we have is just suggestions about what might work. And that's because I am not allowed to randomly assign school policies to charter schools in New York. If I could do that, then I would have bulletproof evidence, but no one has let me do that yet, nor do I think anyone is going to let me do it starting tomorrow. Okay, so let's look at some of the policies of New York City charter schools, and I'll tell you a bit about how they differ. And in the right-hand column is my best guess, which may be wrong, about what is normal for New York City regular public schools. Some of these things I know exactly, some of them I don't know. The number of days in the school year for the average charter school in New York is 192. That's about 2.5 weeks longer than the regular public schools, and some of them have school years that are as long as 220 days, which is 8 more weeks in the school year. The average number of hours per day is 8. That's in contrast to regular public schools, which tend to be about 6. And there are some charter schools that have school days that are longer than this, that are about 10, and there are some that are about 6, the norm. But a little more than half of them have Saturday school. The number of minutes of reading each day on average is 112, so just under 2 hours of reading each day. They also, half of them have 90 minutes or more of math per day. Almost all of them, as I said, give routine internal assessments and have uniforms or strict dress codes. About half of them have a parent contract, and which is not enforceable, but nevertheless it's an attempt to get parents to understand what is expected of them. And just under a quarter of them have what we can easily see or easily characterize as a disciplinary policy that has small rewards and small punishments. So that's a disciplinary policy that often has a point system involved in it, and that in any case rewards students with small rewards, small punishments, as opposed to waiting until they are kicking the student next to them before you pull them out of the classroom. Okay, so which of these policies show up in schools with strong positive effects? The long school year, long school day, Saturday school package. That tends to go together. Most charter schools that have a long school year also have a long school day. Okay. Long reading and math periods, which not surprisingly tends to go with the long school day, because you need that long school day to have those long reading and math periods. The small rewards, small punishments. Discipline, teacher pay that's based on performance and duties. This is in about 60% of charter schools in New York City. Not all of them have this. The rest of them just pay based on seniority and credentials like the regular public schools. And finally, a mission statement that emphasizes academic performance. So those are the things that sort of stand out at the schools that tend to have higher achievement. But as I said at the beginning, this is just suggestive. There is no evidence that if I give a mission statement that emphasizes academic performance to a school, it will suddenly become a more successful charter school. In fact, I think everyone in this room would be very skeptical about whether that would, in fact, make a charter school more successful. Instead, what it's telling us is that there are schools that emphasize academic performance. They say it, they mean it, and those tend to be the ones that are more successful. There are some policies or characteristics that people expect to show up in successful charter schools that do not. The number of years that the school's been in operation doesn't matter. Whether it is an EMO, educational management organization, a charter management organization, or a community-grown organization, doesn't appear to matter. Okay? There are a lot of other characteristics that people think should matter for whether charter schools are successful or not, and we just found no evidence that they really made a difference. Okay? There are also some that we can't test. For instance, we can't test whether being unionized makes a charter school more successful or less successful, because in fact there's no variation really among the charter schools and whether they're unionized or not. Okay? All right, so a question that I'm often asked is, why are New York City charter schools successful compared to other charter schools in the United States? And this question is based on a false premise. It's based on the premise that actually New York City charter schools are more successful than charter schools elsewhere in the United States. Now, I'm not saying it's a false premise because it's wrong that New York City charter schools are more successful. It's a false premise because we have no idea whether they are more successful or not. Okay? 97% of charter schools in the United States have not been evaluated using a lottery method or anything that is close in rigor to a lottery method. The remaining 3% have, and in fact, those charter schools don't look all that different than the New York City charter schools in terms of their effectiveness. So for the relatively small number where we have very good evidence, New York City charter schools look as successful, but not dramatically more successful. And for the other 97%, we have appallingly, unnecessarily poor evidence. Now, I want to just take a step back here, because this is perhaps the most important thing that I'm going to say. And that is that if we have 88% of students in the United States who attend a charter school going to a school that has a lottery, why do we not have lottery-based studies of 88% of the charter schools in the United States? Then we would know which charter schools were the most successful and which charter schools were the least successful. We would know which states looked like they had better charter school laws and which states looked like they had worse charter school laws. We could figure everything out. But with lottery-based studies of only 3% of the charter schools in the United States, we really can't figure much of anything out about which state laws are better and which state laws are worse, or about whether New York City is providing better support than other cities. We just don't know. And there are many reasons that most charter schools, I should say, have been evaluated by some method, but most of them are evaluated by methods that are so unreliable that I totally ignore the results because we just don't know. And if I'm an expert and I totally ignore the results, then people who aren't experts should even be more likely to totally ignore the results because they're less likely to be able to figure out what's good and what's bad in the study. Okay? So who is to blame for this appallingly unnecessarily poor state of evaluation? Well, I have to say I'm at a university. I don't blame myself personally, but I blame universities. And I also blame academic professions because we've not been very good about penalizing researchers who make statements about charter school policy that are based on studies that no one thinks are scientifically rigorous. So I think the academic community bears some responsibility. I think in addition, the media has to bear some responsibility. If you look above the fold only at major media outlets, you will see that they are just as likely to cite a charter school study that is absolutely lousy as they are to cite one that is just mediocre, as they are to cite one that is bulletproof. Okay, there is no discrimination among these three types of studies, and the media are supposed to educate the American public to some extent, and they're just not trying to do that. And then finally, I think the educational policy community does bear some responsibility. If every time a school superintendent saw a lousy study, he or she recognized it for what it was and dropped it in the trash can, people would stop writing those unreliable studies. So we all bear some responsibility. The reality is that we just have to look at the future and do better. And if we do better, we will learn much more and know much more. Okay, let's just assume that New York City's charter schools are good but not unusually good, which I think is probably the case, but we don't know. What would account for that? Well, New York has a pretty solid charter school law. I think New York's law is good. It's certainly in the top 1/3 of laws. It's not remarkable. Similarly, the funding for charter schools is very good in this state, but it's not remarkably better than that of some other states. The authorizers in New York State are good, proactive authorizers. They do the job that they're supposed to do, but they're not remarkably brilliant. It's not that no other state could do what they do. And in fact, some other states have authorizers who I would say are as good. And New York has a moderate strategy for expansion. It is not Arizona, which lets every charter school bloom that feels like blooming regardless of whether it can write a decent proposal. Nor is it like Massachusetts, which has a strategy that we're only going to let a few charter schools through, but they're going to be really good. So New York is someplace in between. It's moderate but high quality on many grounds. What things are peculiarly propitious for New York City charter schools? Well, the first is a very supportive chancellor and Department of Education. I can't tell you how supportive I find them personally as a researcher, and I know that they're very important to the charter schools in New York City. There is also a very high density of charter schools in the city, and they learn from one another, both formally, as in they imitate one another when they think something is going well in another school, but also informally because they hire a lot from one another. And so teachers tend to spread good advice from one charter school. Unfortunately, these factors are not in particularly limited supply, so there's no reason why the supply of charter schools in New York City should suddenly dry up. Okay. I should also mention that there are many things that are not propitious for charter schools in New York City. In case others haven't noticed, this is a rather crowded place, so it's a hard place to get the buildings and grounds for a startup charter school. The media is not particularly supportive of charter schools in New York City. There are some cities where it's much more supportive. It's a very expensive city in which to operate and to start up a new school. So it's not as though it's an environment that's ideal and all those other cities have unideal environments. New York City's not particularly propitious compared to the rest of the United States. Okay, so what are the lessons? The first one, which I've emphasized quite a lot, is that unless we change the evidentiary basis of our understanding of charter schools, I guarantee we will still be here in 20 years telling anecdotes about why some charter schools are better than others, or about why charter schools are better than regular public schools. And we really need to change that situation so that what we're responding to is hard evidence, and then we can make progress from there. There's a good case for rigorously testing charter school type policies in traditional public schools. After all, none of the things that the charter schools are doing are illegal, right, for regular public schools. No one says you cannot have a 200-day school year in the traditional public schools, so why don't we try and find out what happens. Because if that's really the key element, then we'll know at the end of the rigorous test. And then the last lesson is, I don't think there's any obvious reason why we should think that we are at the end of the road for finding additional relatively successful charter schools for New York City. There's no real reason to think that the supply is about to run out. There's our new charter schools opening all the time. The younger ones appear to have just as good effects as the older ones in the data, so I don't see why that is. And I don't see that other areas cannot achieve the same success as New York City, because although it has some excellent circumstances, it also has some things against it, and on average it just has very good but imitatable policies. So that's where I'm going to stop, and I would be really delighted to answer questions, anything from details to things about charter schools elsewhere in the United States.
I'm Lawson Shadburn with Turnaround for Children. This is fabulous work that you've done. I just have one question about something you just said, which is that I'm talking about the limits, the supply of charter schools. You said that there seems to be no evidence that the younger ones aren't as good as the older ones. And yet, there's another issue, which is most of the younger ones are clearly 1-2 years old or so. So if we're indeed hitting the limits of the talent supply and creating charter schools, we won't know it until after it's a little, in some ways, until after it's too late.
That is true. That's true.
Correct?
That's absolutely true. So right now there are quite a number of charter schools, not just in New York City, but also across the United States, that only have kindergartners and first graders in them because they've just opened up. And so we don't get a snapshot of how well they're doing until their students have reached at least the 3rd grade. So we really need to wait 4 years on a charter school before we even get that first snapshot of how well it's doing. So if we have just run out of the supply, then we'll know in a couple of years. Let's put it that way. But right now, the schools that have been open 4 years are doing as well as the schools that have been open 10 years, on average. Not every one, but on average, that's true. Here, Nelson?
Carolyn, you've been remarkably polite in talking about some of the other studies that are out there, and I will name a name, since it routinely appears and did again on Sunday in the Times piece, the Credo study, by Credo at Stanford University, which has become sort of the mantra, twice as many bad charters as good charters, and everyone has picked it up. It's been in every piece for the last year, often with an approving quote by Diane Ravitch following it. So could you just take a moment and talk about your methodological note that you published on that study and try to explain in sort of layman's terms why it doesn't meet the standard?
Well, there are two main problems with that study. The first is a generic problem that could occur in other matching studies, and then there's a problem that's a purely statistical problem. So let me talk about the generic problem first, because that's the one that's interesting, and then I may direct you to the memo after I explain briefly the other one. The generic problem with matching studies is that there is no good way to find a control group. So let's say I have little Ray Fissman, who is attending a New York City charter school, and I wish to find a match for him. Well, Ray he's male, he's white, and I think he's non-poor, okay? Now I have 3 criteria on which I can find my match for Ray. And maybe I'll also choose somebody from his general area of New York City. There are thousands of male, non-poor students who are white, who are from Ray's area of New York City. So there's no simple way to find the control or the match for him. And in fact, the different ways are going to get you different matches. And the only thing that we know about the students who are likely to be matched to Ray is that they likely did not apply to the charter schools. So they probably aren't the same on everything that we don't observe, even if they happen to also be white and male and from the same neighborhoods. So that's a basic problem with matching studies, is that they're unreliable because it just depends on the researcher who ends up getting matched to the students in the charter schools. In the case of the Credo study, there are some particular matching problems which are serious. You are not supposed to match students on the basis of characteristics that schools themselves determine, as opposed to on the basis of characteristics that are inherent to a child. So it's okay to match the child on the basis of race, because kids don't change that very much, maybe a bit, but not a lot, okay? Or gender, again, changed just a bit. Okay, but it is not okay to match kids on the basis of their disability classification. Why? That is controlled by the schools, and a charter school and a regular public school might give the same child 2 different disability classifications. So that is not an okay match characteristic, and the Credo study matches students routinely on the basis of characteristics that are not considered to be okay for match-based studies. In addition, so it has this sort of unreliability, and it has these problems with the matching. The other big problem is a purely statistical problem that I will attempt to describe in a nutshell, but I really do recommend the memo because it's all about equations at this point. The Credo study does not actually match each charter school student to one student in the regular public schools. It matches them to a large number, like 40 students in the regular public schools. If you look at one student's year-to-year variation in test scores, it's quite big because students, one year they have a good day, the next year they have a bad day, they have a cold, they don't have a cold, whatever. If you look at a group of 40 students and their performance from year to year, it's not going to vary nearly as much because all those bad days and good days and the colds average out over the 40 students. So, what Credo does is it looks at my test performance this year compared to my test performance last year if I'm a charter school student, and it says that is attributable to the charter schools. And for the regular public school students, it takes 40 students and compares their performance of the 40 students in the previous year. And it turns out that the correlation from this year's performance to last year's performance is, of course, much higher for the group of 40 than it is for the one student. And this causes a statistical bias because of essentially the equations that they're using to estimate the effects. So there's no lovely fun explanation for it that's going to make it seem really intuitive, but if you go through the equations, you will see that this generates a bias in the estimates that they create. So that in and of itself would cause them to have very unreliable estimates. The statistical mistake, even if their matching were somehow perfect. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Jeff Ginsberg. We're on the East Harlem tutorial program. We're after-school program that's about to open also a charter school as well in 2011. We primarily serve Latino students, and there's something interesting in your study, which is that while it appears your study suggests that Black students and Latino students equally benefit from charters, Black students are 30% overrepresented, Latino students are 10% underrepresented. Is there any evidence as to why it is besides geography, or I guess I should let you confirm geography is one issue, but I assume it is, so besides that, is there any other?
Even once we take account of geography, Black students are still overrepresented in New York City charter schools. Not by as much, not by 30 percentage points, but more like 15 percentage points. So, right, so Hispanic students are definitely underrepresented relative to Black students, and as I said at the outset, there are really no white or Asian students, so it's all about Blacks and Hispanics. We don't know why it is that for some reason the New York City charter schools disproportionately draw Black students. Some of the things that we tried looking at were, we looked at the schools that appeared to have a more Black theme or something like that to them. Harriet Tubman, you might say, hey, that would draw Black students disproportionately, has the name of a famous Black woman in history. It doesn't actually. It's not that simple. It's not something like the schools that have traditional ties to the Black community account for all of this difference and vice versa. What people have said to me, and this is anecdotal, so I do not have evidence on this, is that they think Latino parents, particularly recent immigrants, are more inclined to go with what appears to be the status quo in a country that's relatively new to them. They do not feel very confident making a choice that is outside of what the government would regularly assign them. So that's the explanation I hear most often, but others may have superior explanations. I really don't know the answer. Mm-hmm.
You told us to ask you
Yes.
about the question of push-outs. So
Yes.
talk about that.
So an interesting question is what happens to charter school students who go back to the traditional public schools. So first of all, one thing that people worry about is that charter schools take students, they may look unpromising, but then they push all of the least promising ones back to the regular public schools. Well, about 14% of students who attend a charter school at some point leave and go back to the traditional public schools in our data. And about half of those leave in a way that I would describe as voluntary. So if I get to the end of my charter school's grades, it stops at grade 6, I have to go back to the regular public schools typically. But about half of them go back when they could stay in their charter school. It still has the next grade, and they just have voluntarily decided to go back. So what do we know about these students who go back to the regular public schools voluntarily? Well, it turns out that they're not more likely to be black, they're not more likely to be Hispanic, they are not more likely to be low achievers in the charter schools, and they're not more likely to be making small gains in the charter schools. They're not more likely to be poor, they're not more likely to be English language learners, and they're not more likely to be disabled. This suggests that the charter schools are not actually pushing out the less successful charter school students back into the regular public schools. We don't know that for certain, but there's no evidence that they are. The one difference between the students who voluntarily go back and those who do not is that the students who voluntarily go back are disproportionately likely to be white or Asian. And I suspect, but we do not know, that one of the reasons they are more likely to go back is that charter schools are fairly small. I've shown you they have very small percentages of white and Asian students. And a white or an Asian student is typically the only white or Asian student, not only in his or her classroom, but often in the whole grade or sometimes 2 or 3 grades. And it may just be that parents don't feel okay with that type of racial, ethnic isolation. Right now, we do not have a very good handle on what happens to charter school students when they go back to the regular public schools, most of them not voluntarily, but just because their charter school ends, because we just don't have enough data on those who do. But I think 3 years from now, 2 years from now, we should be able to say something interesting about, do they just return to their original trajectory, or do they stay on a higher level of performance? We just don't know the answer to that question right now. Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on something, because you were laying out some I hesitate to use the word blame, but for why we know so little about these 88% of all charter school students nationwide who apply for the lottery. And you didn't say it's because nobody wrote into the charter school law that every charter school has to send an Excel spreadsheet of their lottery data to the State Department of Education, so that the State Department of Education can A, audit the lottery to make sure they are actually selecting their students randomly, and B, evaluate what they're doing with their students, right? Nobody has done that. In our study in Chicago, in your study here in New York, and in the Boston study, researchers have had to gone out with a team of graduate students and hand collect lottery data to do these kinds of studies. Whereas it would be very easy for a State Department of Education to say, you know what, you have to just send us all the information, and then we're going to evaluate.
Right. So Jonah is absolutely right. That's Jonah Rokoff from Columbia. He's absolutely right that there is no state that mandates that lottery data be sent to the State Department of Education or the district or anything like that. In my experience, charter schools are cooperative when you ask them for their lottery data. I've had very high levels of cooperation, and we've had high levels of cooperation in Chicago. But that doesn't mean that it isn't work. It still is work to go and get the lottery data from them. So there's no reason for me to think that if someone mandated that they do it, they wouldn't do it, since in fact they give it to researchers voluntarily who don't have mandates. So I don't want to blame the charter schools in the sense that I think they haven't shown unwillingness particularly. But state policymakers have not made it a priority to make it easy to evaluate charter schools well. I have tried in talking to national charter school organizations to say, push this yourselves, because you'll get better evaluations if people have the lottery data. And if you get better evaluations, you're much more likely to be fairly evaluated than you are right now. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Carolyn. James Around from the New York City Charter School Center. So, when you published the general report, some people said that you had likely had inflated the effect of student achievement and jumped the gun and didn't wait for the technical report to come out. Now that the technical report has been out for a few months, what has been, have they come back?
No, because the person who wrote the thing saying that the technical that somehow the results were exaggerated, actually had seen the draft of the technical report when he wrote his thing, so he already knew what was coming in the technical report. The technical report covers all the possible issues that can come up in a lottery-based study. A lottery-based studies are very straightforward. They're easy, right? You just follow one group of kids and you follow the other group of kids. So the only things that can come up that are problems are attrition, students who just disappear because they leave New York City altogether. Students who return to their regular public schools, I just talked about them. There are a few other minor things like grade retention. Only 1% of charter school students and regular public school students in the study are retained, so it turns out that that's a non-issue. And there are some things like how much you want to extrapolate from the data. The data really show that students who've been in charter schools for 8 years have very similar per year effects as students who've been in for 6 years, as students who've been in for 4 years, as students who've been in for 2 years. So it looks like we should feel pretty confident about extrapolating from the data. The other thing that people worry about a lot with lottery studies, which does not affect New York City, but might affect, say, Boston, is that there could be some schools that have big lotteries because they're desirable, and other schools that have very little of a lottery because people just don't really want to go there. And what people worry about with lottery-based studies is, this study will reflect the more successful schools that end up with drawing a lot of applicants. In New York City, for whatever reason, that's not the case. Every charter school has a long waiting list, basically after its first year of operation. And if you look at the schools that have the longer waiting lists and the schools that have the shorter waiting lists, they have about the same effect on student achievement. Now, in Boston, they actually had some charter schools in their lottery-based study that had such small or non-existent lotteries that they could not study them. So I think that it is legitimate to say that in Boston, they're looking at the schools that have big lotteries and they had to ignore some other schools.
So the discussion of test scores and the improvement actually reminded me of something that Chancellor Klein mentioned about his teacher that he met that cared only about the 2.9s and 3.1s. I was wondering if you see any difference in the distribution of test scores in charter schools, the extent to which they're creating more uniform, whether they're creating more uniform increases or whether they're in some sense juking the stats themselves, just really focusing on the 2.9s to look stellar in their final Regents exams. And if so, whether that ties in any way to student or teacher incentives.
So that's a very good question. Let me start out by saying that New York City charter schools start with a population of students who have low achievement, and it's typically below the median. It is below the median for New York City schools. And their students are actually fairly concentrated in a range of student achievement, which goes from about, the 30th percentile to about the 45th percentile. So there's a lot of concentration right there. When we try to see whether the charter schools have a different effect on the students who come in with higher achievement versus the students who come in with lower achievement, we don't find any evidence that they have more effect on the low achieving students or more effect on the initially high achieving students. However, I will say that the students don't come in with the full range of achievement. We basically never see a student who walks into a New York City charter school who's already at the 95th percentile. So we don't get to see what they would do with that 95th percentile student. And it's also rare to see them educate severely multiply impaired disabled children who would sort of fill out the very bottom of the achievement distribution. And I think that's because those students often don't apply. They have very special, environments designed for them in the regular public schools. And switching into a newly founded charter school is probably not the idea for them. So right now it just looks like they have about the same effect on everyone, and that's what the data are telling us. I wish I had a more interesting story for you. Sometimes I don't have an interesting story, and I wish I did. The back.
Elizabeth Stock from Computers for Youth. There was a study that David Brooks spoke about that was on the Thomas Academy that showed impact scores of 0.4. And I don't know if that was Roland Fires.
Yes, it is.
When I read inside the study, one of the things that I thought was very interesting that sort of brought about a question of maybe there should be more study in this area is he also looked at the siblings of the kids who were at Thomas Academy. And with the idea that those siblings were not going to Thomas Academy. And he found an impact size on those siblings of 0.2. So my question for you would be, what effect are the charter schools having on the home environment that are therefore bleeding over to the siblings? And is there a way to study that in addition?
Yes, there is. There is no reason why, if I can get the New York City Department of Education to agree, to give me data on every sibling of a charter school student in the New York City public schools. relatively straightforward exercise. So in theory, we could test this, this hypothesis that the charter schools are bleeding over or spilling over onto siblings and families much more generally. Harlem Children's Zone has Promise Academy 1 and 2, and those, I think, I don't pick out individual charter schools in my study. It's an agreement in the study, but Roland Fryer has done this study of those 2 charter schools, which are part of my study as well, but they are just part of it. And they do have very big positive effects. So it might be much easier to see their spillover effects onto siblings than to see some other charter schools' spillover effects. I'll also say that those charter schools are a little bit different than some others in that Harlem Children's Zone has what I would describe as a more of a community, family-based approach to educating children. Has a lot more after-school programs, family-type programs that's connected with a big community organization. It may actually be easier for it to have spillover effects on the family than a charter school that does not have all of that other infrastructure. But I don't know that to be true. It's just something we could study and haven't studied.
You mentioned sort of the commonalities of the successful schools, charter schools. Did you study what were the sort of common elements of the schools that were below the grade
Unsuccessful?
unsuccessful?
Well, you can flip all of the signs of the things I talked about. So you can say that the unsuccessful schools are less likely to have a long school year, a long school day, so on. There's only one characteristic, this is, I think it's humorous because I don't think it's very meaningful, that shows up as a characteristic of unsuccessful charter schools. It's a marker, and that is that they reserve a seat on their board of trustees for a parent. I don't know what that means. I can't imagine that the parent is causing the problems in the charter school. So it must be the case that it's telling us something about their management or governance style. It doesn't, that's why I said these things are not causal. It's just like saying giving a school a good mission statement will not turn it into a successful school. Putting a parent on a school board that doesn't on a board of trustees that doesn't have one is very unlikely to make a successful charter school unsuccessful. So they're suggestive evidence, but they're not. It's not causal evidence.
Okay, one more question. One of the things you didn't look at is the cost of educating a kid in a charter school
Right.
versus, and is there a reason why that's not?
Why that's in the New York City charter schools. One of the things we are getting at this point, we have gotten, in fact, the data, but we haven't incorporated it yet in this version of the study that I talked about today, is the differences in spending among the New York City charter schools. The differences in spending do not come from the state or the city. That's pretty much the same across the charter schools in New York City. The differences come from the fact that some of them have philanthropic foundations that help to round out their spending. Now, across the United States on the whole, charter school spending is about 66% of that in the local public schools. And if you add in the philanthropic money, you get up to about 70% of regular public school spending in the local public schools. So it doesn't, for the vast majority of charter schools, it's really not making a big difference. In New York City, what we see is that there are a few of the charter schools that have quite a lot of philanthropic money that boosts their school spending by, say, 18 percentage points, something like that. So they get up from being around at about 75% of the regular public schools to something closer to 93% of the regular public school spending. It's not always easy to sort out all this philanthropic data. I could go into that for a while because it's not necessarily just owned by the local school. Some of it's owned by the overarching organization. But many charter schools in New York do not get any extra money. So they're basically are surviving on what the state and city gives them. And that's if we look sort of by and large, you want to think of that as being the norm. It is the case that some of the charter schools that have the most positive effects also have more resources. So there is a correlation there. There definitely is a correlation. Mm-hmm.
So you were talking about spillovers to siblings. I want to think about, like, are you concerned about the spillovers to peers? In the sense, one story for this is that we skim out all the motivated, well-behaved kids. They're all in the same school. They benefit from that, but there's a spillover back to their home schools because they're gone. Is there any, do you have any evidence, anything that came out of the lotteries that can address that issue?
I think the answer is no. So let me try and give you both the answer where I feel confident and then the answer where we really don't know what's going on. I'm confident that the charter schools are only having a very tiny effect on peer quality in the regular public schools. Because even the regular public schools that have lost the most students to charter schools are losing maybe 5% of their student population. Now, you could say those are the crucial 5% of students. Without them, nothing else happens. But that doesn't seem very likely. And the average regular public school in New York City has lost fewer than 1% of its students to charter schools. So it's very unlikely that they are tremendously affected. Now, turning to the charter schools, it's quite possible that one of the reasons that they perform better is that they have gathered together a group of families and students who want to be there, okay, for whatever reason. They don't look more advantaged. In fact, they look less advantaged, and they don't tend to be doing better in the regular public schools before they leave. They tend to be doing worse. Okay? But they may be really happy to be together and motivated because they're here, they're in a school they like, they're all with one another, they have the same beliefs and motivations. Some of that is actually part of the charter school model, right? So part of that you don't want to take away from the charter schools. You want to say, well, the charter school model is to gather together people who agree on an educational idea, a disciplinary philosophy, a curriculum, etc. And they feel comfortable together and they work together better, and that's part of the charter school idea. I think that's fair to say. It may also be fair to say that part of the charter school effect would disappear if you went from having a small number of charter schools in New York City to having thousands of charter schools in New York City of the same size, not of the size of New York City regular public schools, because then they would gather together groups of peers who would perhaps be less cohesive or have less of this kind of nice peer effect. And I think we just don't know that. We just don't know. So I'd be glad to take the last question, or I'm glad to finish up here since I think I'm just about out of time.
Well, just one of the questions that comes up around charters sometimes is localized effects in
Yes.
a particular community. And certainly Harlem comes up in
Yes,
this discussion.
yes.
And I'm curious if there's future directions for research that you're engaged in or anybody else is around that kind of issue. What's happening with the other schools?
Right. So I think that's something we want to study. Let me back up a little bit and say something about that. One of the most, this study, all it does is it tells you how are the charter schools doing relative to the regular public schools. It does not tell you how the regular public schools are reacting. It does not tell you how Chancellor Klein is reacting to the existence of charter schools, which is actually an important question in and of itself. Maybe he manages all the rest of his schools differently because they exist. It does not tell you about how resources moving out of the regular public schools into the charter schools affect the regular public schools. There are a lot of open questions at the end of a study like this. And those questions matter a lot, and in fact, I would argue that they matter more. So let's just talk about one narrow question in there. How is Chancellor Klein reacting to the existence of charter schools? Does it make his life easier or harder that they exist in New York City? If we assume that his performance has a big effect on the performance of New York City's schools, regular public schools, then making his life much easier or much harder would presumably also have a big effect on the regular public schools, which serve 1.1 million students, many more students than are served by the charter schools. So even if it only had a small effect on him and on all of those 1.1 million students, it might still be that that small effect added up over 1.1 million is more important than a big effect on the charter school students, which serve about 12,000 students at this point. So, so those questions are really important. We have tried to answer those questions in states where there are a lot of charter schools, because that's where we are most likely to be able to see how the regular public schools are reacting. And the state that's the most obvious there is Arizona, because it has a much, much larger share of students in charter schools than any other state in the United States. And we can find some cities in Arizona, like Mesa, where almost a third of students are attending charter schools, and other cities in Arizona where relatively few students are attending charter schools. We can look before and after the charter schools open and try and look at how the public schools react. And there it looks as though the public schools have reacted positively to the existence of charter schools, largely by improving their own performance to compete with them. We would like to be able to do something like that in Harlem, which is going to be the first place, or the South Bronx, that we can do it in New York City, because those are the places that have the high density of charter schools. I don't think we're really there yet, though. I mean, I just don't think there is still enough competition from charter schools to see what the effects are on those areas of New York City. But, give it another 5 to 7 years and we may be able to see.
Thank you very
Thanks.